Ladies and gentlemen, today is my manga reading log for 2023. I'll be going through everything I read over the past year, month by month, week by week, day by day. I won't be really giving any sort of review or analysis on what I liked or didn't. I'm just sort of going to be listing things off, like reading a list. It's just going to be sort of a very relaxing video that you can just zone out to. It's chill Tuesday vibes to study and sleep to. So it's sort of like ASMR. Baka, hey, Manga Tuesday. I straight up just forgot to say, I'm Darcy, and this is Manga Tuesday, episode 152. I'm a fucking idiot. Yeah, I did this last year as well. I was cataloguing everything I read for the entire year, and I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed making the video, and I've enjoyed re-watching the video I made last year myself on just random occasions, so I decided to do it again, naturally, because, you know, what's the point of reading if you don't meticulously catalogue everything you read the minute you've read it, and then, yeah. Oh, also, this is my manga reading log, so it'll be all the manga I read, but I'll also include any books or comics if I read them. Anyways, without any further ado, let's just jump into it. On January 5th, I read the Watamote Special New Year's chapter. On January 6th, I read Don't Expect That Kind of Persona From Me, Volume 1. On January 7th, I read Don't Expect That Kind of Persona From Me, Volume 2, which completes that series. It sucked. On January 8th, I started reading The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and I also read Can't Defy the Lonely Girl, bonus chapter, sort of a final epilogue bonus chapter. So that wraps that up completely. On January 9th, I finished reading The Time Machine, and I read Kubo Won't Let Me Be Invisible, Volume 3. On January 11th, I read Kubo Won't Let Me Be Invisible, Volume 4. On January 14th, I read Gakuen Polizei, Volumes 1 and 2, which completes that series. On January 15th, I read Rosario Vampire, Volumes 1, 2 and 3. On January 16th, I read Rosario Vampire, Volumes 4 and 5. On January 17th, I read Rosario Vampire, Volumes 6, 7 and 8. On January 18th, I read Rosario Vampire Volumes 9 and 10, which completes the series, kinda. You'll understand in a moment. On January 19th, I read Watamote, Chapter 212. On January 20th, I read The Conditions of Paradise, which I think is a one and doneski, and I started reading A Study in Scarlet. On January 21st, I read Rosario Vampire Season 2, Volume 1. On January 23rd, I read Rosario Vampire Season 2, Volume 2. On January 25th, I read Rosario Vampire Season 2, Volumes 3 and 4, and I continued reading A Study in Scarlet. On Jan 26th, I read Rosario Vampire Season 2, Volumes 5 and 6. On January 27th, I read Rosario Vampire Season 2, Volumes 7 and 8, and I continued reading A Study in Scarlet. January 28th, I read Rosario Vampire Season 2, Volumes 9, 10, 11, and 12, and I continued reading A Study in Scarlet. On January 29th, I continued reading A Study in Scarlet. January 30th, I read Rosario Vampire Season 2, Volumes 13 and 14, which completes Rosario Vampire completely, and I also continued reading A Study in Scarlet. On January 31st, I finished reading A Study in Scarlet, and I also read Hitomi-chan is Shy with Strangers, Volume 1, and that completes the month of January. So in January, I read 32 volumes, 3 chapters and 2 books, with an average of 1.032 volumes per day. And just a quick little aside, with omnibuses, usually I would count them as just, one book when I'm counting my collection and that, but for the reading log, I break them down into the original volume. So if I read a 3-in-1 omnibus, I'll count it as 3 volumes. I think it's a little more accurate to how much I read on any given day or week or month. So that's just a little side note. All the other monthly recaps will be a lot quicker than this one. They'll be like 5 seconds. It'll be a flash. You'll have to don't blink or you'll miss it. On February 1st, I read Teasing Master Tagaki-san, Volume 16. February 2nd, I read Watamote, Chapter 213, Part 1, and Shikimori's Not Just a Cutie, Volume 11. On February 3rd, I read Kashimashi Girl Meets Girl, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. On February 4th, I read Kashimashi Girl Meets Girl, Volumes 4 and 5, which completes that series, and what a wonderful series it was. February 5th, I read When Will Ayamu Make His Move, Volume 8. On February 8th, I started reading The Sign of the Four. February 9th, I read Uzaki-chan Wants to Hang Out, Volume 8, and I continued reading The Sign of the Four. On February 10th, I continued reading The Sign of the Four. February 11th, I continued reading The Sign of the Four. February 12th, I continued reading The Sign of the Four. On February 13th, I read Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution, the little one and Dunsky, and I finished reading The Sign of the Four. On February 14th, I read Turns Out My Dick Was a Cute Girl, chapters 14 and 15. February 16th, I read Watamote, chapter 213, part 2, and Slam Dunk, volume 1. On February 17th, I read Slam Dunk volumes 2, 3, 4, and 5. February 18th, I read Slam Dunk volumes 6, 7, and 8. February 19th, I read Slam Dunk volumes 9, 10, and 11. February 20th, I read Slam Dunk volumes 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. February 21st, I read Slam Dunk volumes 17 and 18. February 22nd, I read Slam Dunk volumes 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. On February 23rd, I read Slam Dunk volume 25, 26, 27, 28, and 29. And on February 24th, I read Slam Dunk volumes 30 and 31, and that completes Slam Dunk. On February 25th, I read Hitomi-chan Is Shy with Strangers, volume 2. February 26th, I read Failed Princesses, volumes 1, 2, and 3. February 27th, I read Failed Princesses, volumes 4, 5, and 6, and that completes that series. And on February 28th, I read Yotsuba chapter 109, and that completes the month of February. So in February, I read 48 volumes, 5 chapters, and 1 book, with an average of 1.714 volumes per day. A solid month. Kicking off March, on March 1st, I read Cats and Sugar Bowls, which is just a one and done ski. March 2nd, I read When Will Ayamu Make His Move, volume 9. On March 3rd, I read The Boy Who Cried Wolf Tells a Lie Today also, volumes 1, 2, and 3. March 4th, I read The Boy Who Cried Wolf Tells a Lie Today also, volumes 4 and 5, and that completes that series. And what a great series. March 5th, I read Kubo Won't Let Me Be Invisible, volume 5. March 6th, I read I Think I Turned My Childhood Friend Into a Girl, volume 1, and I started reading A Game of Chess and Other Stories. I read the Invisible Collection, and I started reading 24 Hours in a Woman's Life. It's a collection of 4 short stories, you know. March 7th, I finished reading 24 Hours in a Woman's Life, the second short story in A Game of Chess and Other Stories. March 8th, I read the third short story, Incident on Lake Geneva, and I also read Kinoro Mosaic, volume 1. On March 9th, I read Kinoro Mosaic, Kinoro Mosaic, volume 2. On March 10th, I read On March 10th, I read Kaniro Mosaic, Volume 3. On March 11th, I read Kanoro Mosaic, Volume 4 and 5. On March 13th, I read Kanoro Mosaic, Volume 6 and 7, and Ichi the Killer, Volume 1, and I also read the final short story, A Game of Chess, which completes A Game of Chess and Other Stories. March 14th, I read Kanoro Mosaic Volume 8 and Ichi the Killer, Volumes 2 and 3. On March 15th, I read Kanoro Mosaic Volumes 9 and 10 and Ichi the Killer, Volumes 4 and 5. March 16th, I read Watamote, Chapter 213, Part 3, and Kanoro Mosaic Volume 11, which completes Kanoro Mosaic, kind of. And I also read Ichi the Killer, Volumes 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, which completes Ichi the Killer. On March 17th, I read Hitomi-chan is Shy with Strangers, Volume 3. On March 18th, I read Laid Back Camp, Volume 12. On March 19th, I read Turns Out My Dick Was a Cute Girl, chapters 16 through to 20. On March 20th, I reread Bloom Into You, Volumes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. March 21st, I reread Bloom Into You, Volumes 6, 7, and 8, which completes my reread of Bloom Into You. March 22nd, I read the Bloom Into You Anthology, Volumes 1 and 2, which completes that little anthology thingamajig. And I also started reading I Will Forget This Feeling Someday. On March 23rd, I read Kubo Won't Let Me Be Invisible Volume 6, and I continued reading I Will Forget This Feeling Someday. On March 24th, I continued reading I Will Forget This Feeling Someday. And on March 25th, I finished reading I Will Forget This Feeling Someday. March 26th, I read Comey Can't Communicate, Volume 22. March 27th, I read Comey Can't Communicate, Volume 23, and Bomber, which is One and Dunsky by Tezuka. On March 29th, I read Pink, which is also a One and Dunsky, so it's complete ski. On March 30th, I read Kanoro Mosaic Best Wishes, sort of a little epilogue final volume, so that finally fully completes and wraps up Kanoro Mosaic, pronunciation unknown. And on March 31st, I read Yotsuba, Chapter 110, and that completes the month of March. So for March, I read 48 volumes again, 7 chapters and 2 books, with an average of 1.548 volumes per day. Yeah. On April 2nd, I read Turns Out My Dick Was a Cute Girl, chapters 21 and 22. April 3rd, I read I Think I Turned My Childhood Friend Into a Girl, Volume 2, and I started reading The Gift of the Magi, collection of short stories. April 4th, I read Sandland, a One of Dunsky, so that's done, and I continued reading The Gift of the Magi. On April 5th, I read Powerpuff Girls Z, Volume 1, and I continued reading The Gift of the Magi. April 6th, I read Powerpuff Girls Z, Volume 2, which completes that series. I also read Vinland Saga, Book 1, and continued reading The Gift of the Magi. April 7th, I read Vinland Saga, Book 2 and 3. April 8th, I read Vinland Saga, Book 4 and 5, and I continued reading The Gift of the Magi. On April 9th, I read Vinland Saga, Book 6, and I continued reading The Gift of the Magi. April 10th, I read Vinland Saga, Book 7, 8, and 9, and I continued reading The Gift of the Magi. April 11th, I read Vinland Saga, Book 10 and 11, and I finished reading The Gift of the Magi. On April 12th, I read Vinland Saga, Book 12 and 13, and I also read chapters 192 through to 200 of Vinland Saga, bringing me up to date on that. April 13th, I read the Watamote special flashback chapter thingamajig. April 14th, I read A Tropical Fish Yearns for Snow, volumes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. April 15th, I read A Tropical Fish Yearns for Snow, volumes 6, 7, 8, and 9, which completes the series. April 17th, I read Donuts Under a Crescent Moon, volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that completes that series. April 18th, I read Hitami-chan is Shy with Strangers, volumes 4, and I started reading the first volume of Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, the big box set version of volume 1. April 19th, I finished reading the first big book of Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, and I also read No Matter What You Say, Furi-san is Scary, volume 1. On April 20th, I read Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, volume 2, which completes Nausicaa. On April 21st, I read Pokemon Journeys, volume 1. April 22nd, I read Pokemon Journeys, volumes 2 and 3. April 23rd, I read Pokemon Journeys Volume 4, which completes that series. On April 24th, I read Kyuko-chan Volume 1. April 25th, I read Vinland Saga Chapter 201 and When Will Ayamu Make His Move Volume 10. On April 26th, I read Shikimori's Not Just a Cutie Volume 12. April 27th, I read Watamote Chapter 214, Part 1. And on April 30th, I read Boku to Boku, Volumes 1 and 2, which completes that series, and that completes the month of April. So in April, I read 62 volumes, 4 chapters and 1 book, which is an average of 2.066 volumes per day. This is the biggest month. I read the most volumes this month. Spoiler alert. On May 1st, I read Can't Defy the Lonely Girl After All I Love You, which was I guess it was a sort of a spin-off one-shot thing, so I forgot about that. So now that finally fully completes the Can't Defy the Lonely Girl saga. Then on May 10th, I read Hitami-chan is Shy with Strangers, Volume 5. May 15th, I read Goodbye My Rose Garden, Volume 1. May 17th, I read Goodbye My Rose Garden, Volume 2. On May 18th, I read Watamote, Chapter 214, Part 2. On May 22nd, I read Goodbye My Rose Garden Volume 3, which completes that series. On May 26th, I read Vinland Saga, Chapter 202. On May 29th, I read Sherlock Bones, Volume 1. And then on May 31st, I read Meet Me at the Borderline. And that completes the month of May. A pretty shitty month. Yeah, so May was pretty shit, the first terrible month of the year. I only read 5 volumes, 3 chapters, and 1 book, with an average of 0.161 volumes per day. Starting off June, on June 5th, I read Teasing Master Dagaki-san, Volume 17, and Sherlock Bones, Volume 2. June 7th, I read No Matter What You Say, Furi-san is Scary, Volume 2. June 8th, I read Watamote, Chapter 214, Part 3. June 9th, I read Sherlock Bones, Volume 3. June 12th, I read Turns Out My Dick Was a Cute Girl, Chapters 23 and 24. June 18th, I read Sherlock Bones, Volume 4. On June 20th, I read Kubo Won't Let Me Be Invisible, Volume 7, and Sherlock Bones, Volume 5. On June 22nd, I read a Watamote special chapter, and I also read Sherlock Bones, Volume 6. June 25th, I read Sherlock Bones, Volume 7, which completes Sherlock Bones, and I also read Vinland Saga, Chapter 203. And then on June 29th, I read Watamote, Chapter 215, and that completes the month of June. So for June, I read 9 volumes, 6 chapters, and 0 books. The first month all year where we have read 0 books. It's a pretty shitty, but this month was really just as bad as last month. And we had an average of 0.3 volumes read per day. Also, a quick little side note, I made a mistake. Sherlock Bones Volume 1 was actually a reread. I read that one years ago. On July 3rd, I read Laid Back Camp Volume 13 and Sumo Momomomo Volume 1. July 5th, I read Sumomomo Momomomo Volumes 2 and 3. July 7th, I read Sumomomo Volumes 4 and 5. On July 8th, I read Momomomo Volume 6. July 10th, I read Momomomo Volumes 7 and 8. On July 11th, I read Your Name Another Side Earthbound Volumes 1 and 2, which completes that little 2-volume Your Name side story spin-off thing. And I also read Sumomomomomomomomo Volumes 9 and 10. And on July 12th, I read Sumomomomo Volumes 11 and 12, and that completes Sumomomomo. July 13th, I read No Matter What You Say, Furi-san is Scary, Volumes 3, and I started reading Survivor. July 15th, I read Gabriel Dropout, Volumes 12, and I continued reading Survivor. July 16th, I read Mujirushi, The Sign of Dreams, which is a one and doneski, and I continued reading Survivor. July 17th, I read Don't Toy With Me, Miss Nagataro, Volume 14. I also read 5 Seconds Before a Witch Falls in Love, which is a one and doneski, so it's complete ski, and I also continued reading Survivor. July 18th, I read Turns Out My Dick Was a Cute Girl, chapters 25 and 26. I read Ladies on Top, Volume 1, and I finished reading Survivor. On July 19th, I read Buso Renkin, Volume 1, and Maid Skater, Chapter 1. On July 21st, I read Buso Renkin, Volume 2. July 22nd, I read Buso Renkin, Volume 3. July 23rd, I read Buso Renkin Volumes 4 and 5, and I started reading Breakfast at Tiffany's. On July 24th, I read Buso Renkin Volumes 6 and 7, and I finished reading Breakfast at Tiffany's. July 25th, I read Vinland Saga Chapter 204 and Buso Renkin Volume 8. On July 26th, I read Buso Renkin Volumes 9 and 10, and that completes Buso Renkin. On July 27th, I read Watamote Chapter 216 and Are You Lost Volume 1. July 31st, I read 1 Pound Gospel Volume 1, and that will complete the month of July for 2023. So for July, I read 33 volumes, 4 chapters, and 2 books, with an average of 1.065 volumes per day. Getting things back on track this month. On the 7th of August, I read 1 Pound Gospel Volumes 2 and 3, and No Matter What You Say, Furi-san is Scary, Volume 4. On August 8th, I read 1 Pound Gospel Volume 4, and that completes that series. On August 9th, I read I Think I Turned My Childhood Friend Into a Girl, Volume 3, and I reread Kiss 'em White Lily for My Dearest Girl, Volumes 1 and 2. On August 12th, I reread Kiss 'em White Lily for My Dearest Girl, Volume 3. On August 14th, I reread Kiss 'em White Lily for My Dearest Girl, Volume 4, and I read, for the first time, Kiss 'em White Lily for My Dearest Girl, Volumes 5 and 6. August 15th, I read Kiss 'em White Lily for My Dearest Girl, Volumes 7 and 8. August 16th, I read Kiss 'em White Lily for My Dearest Girl, Volumes 9 and 10, and that completes that series. On August 17th, I read Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, Volumes 11 and Volume 12. August 19th, I read Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid Kana's Daily Life, Volume 8. August 21st, I read Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid Kana's Daily Life, Volumes 9 and 10. On August 22nd, I read Red Hood, Volume 1. Then on August 27th, I read Yotsuba, Chapter 111. August 29th, I read Vinland Saga, Chapter 205. August 31st, I read Ini Kaita Mochi wa Kaita Moki. One shot, so it's a one and done ski. The pronunciation's a little off. I also read Red Hood, Volumes 2 and 3, which completes Red Hood. And I also read Watamote, Chapter 216, Part 2. And then that completes the month of August. So for August, I read 23 volumes, 4 chapters, and 0 books. The second month with no books read. And it was an average of 0.742 volumes per day. I know you very care about the averages, volumes per day. It's a very important statistic that we need. On September 1st, I read Uzaki-chan Wants to Hang Out, Volume 9, and I started reading Animal Farm. On September 2nd, I finished reading Animal Farm by George Orwell. September 3rd, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, Volume 1. September 4th, I read JoJo's Part 5, Volumes 2 and 3. September 5th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, Volume 4. September 6th, I read JoJo's Part 5, Volumes 5 and 6. September 7th, I read JoJo's Part 5, Volumes 7 and 8. And on September 8th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, Volume 9, which completes Part 5 of JoJo's. September 9th, I read Rohan at the Louvre. It's just a one and done ski. September 10th, I read Little Leo, which is also a one and done ski. On September 11th, I reread Frag Time, the omnibus, so that completes my reread of Frag Time. I also started reading the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. I read the first story, Silver Blaze. On September 12th, I read The Yellow Face from the Memoirs of Sherlock, and I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 6, Volumes 1 and 2. On September 13th, I read JoJo's Part 6, Volumes 3 and 4, and I read The Stockbroker's Clerk and The Gloria Scott from the Memoirs of Sherlock. September 14th, I read JoJo's Part 6, Volume 5 and 6, and I also read The Musgrave Ritual from the Memoirs of Sherlock. On September 15th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 6, Volumes 7, 8 and 9. September 16th, I read JoJo's Part 6, Volumes 10, 11, 12 and 13, and I read The Regate Squires and The Crooked Man from the Memoirs of Sherlock. On September 17th, I read The Resident Patient from the Memoirs of Sherlock, and I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 6, Volumes 14 and 15. On September 18th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 6, Volumes 16 and 17, which completes Part 6 of JoJo's, and I also read The Greek Interpreter from the Memoirs of Sherlock. September 19th, I read The Naval Treaty and The Final Problem from the Memoirs of Sherlock, and that completes the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. On September 20th, I read Hello Melancholic, Volumes 1, 2 and 3, and that completes that series. September 21st, I read Watamote Chapter 217, Part 1, and When Will Ayumu Make His Move, Volume 11, and I started reading The Hound of the Baskervilles. September 22nd, I read When Will Ayumu Make His Move, Volume 12, and I continued reading The Hound of the Baskervilles. On September 23rd, I read Comey Can't Communicate, Volumes 24 and 25, and I continued reading The Hound of the Baskervilles. September 24th, I read Comey Can't Communicate, Volume 26, and I continued reading The Hound of the Baskervilles. Then on September 25th, I finished reading The Hound of the Baskervilles, and I also read Goodbye Erie. That's a one and done ski, so it's a complete ski. That's yeah. September 26th, I read Voices of a Distant Star. It is also a one and done ski. September 27th, I read Kuko-chan Volume 2, which completes Kuko-chan. On September 28th, I read Vinland Saga, Chapter 206. Then on September 29th, I read Dragon Ball Super, Volume 5. And on September 30th, I read Dragon Ball Super, Volumes 6, 7, and 8. And then that completes the month of September. So in September, I read 54 volumes, 2 chapters, and 3 books. The only month all year, I think, where I read 3 books. And I had an average of 1.8 volumes read per day. Kicking things off for October, on the 1st of October, I read Dragon Ball Super Volume 9. On October 2nd, I read Dragon Ball Super Volumes 10, 11, and 12. October 3rd, I read Dragon Ball Super Volume 13. On October 4th, I read Dragon Ball Super Volume 14. On October 5th, I read the Watamote Gangan Online 15th Anniversary Special Chapter thingy. And I also read Dragon Ball Super Volume 15. On October 6th, I read Kaguhara's Fetish Notebook, Chapters 1 through to 9. And I also read Dragon Ball Super Volumes 16 and 17. October 7th, I read Dragon Ball Super Volume 18, and I also read Runaway with Me Girl Volume 1. On October 8th, I read Runaway with Me Girl Volumes 2 and 3, and that completes that series. On October 9th, I started rereading Dusty, and I also read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 7, Steel Ball Run, Volumes 1 and 2. On October 10th, I read JoJo's Part 7, Steel Ball Run Volume 3, and I continued rereading Dusty. October 11th, I read JoJo's Part 7, Steel Ball Run Volumes 4 and 5, and I continued rereading Dusty. On October 12th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 7, Steel Ball Run Volume 6, and I also continued rereading Dusty. On October 13th, I finished rereading Dusty, and I also read JoJo's Part 7, Steel Ball Run, Volumes 7 and 8. October 14th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 7, Steel Ball Run, Volumes 9 and 10. On October 15th, I read JoJo's Part 7, Steel Ball Run, Volumes 11, 12, 13, and 14. On October 16th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 7, Steel Ball Run, Volumes 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And then on October 17th, I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 7, Steel Ball Run, Volumes 21, 22, 23, and 24, and that completes Part 7 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So then on October 18th, I read Nichiju Volume 11. October 19th, I read Hitomi-chan is Shy with Strangers Volume 6. And on October 23rd, I started reading The Queen's Gambit. October 24th, I continued reading The Queen's Gambit. October 25th, I read Dragon Ball Super Volume 19, and I also continued reading The Queen's Gambit. October 26th, I read Watamote Chapter 217, Part 2, and I also continued reading The Queen's Gambit. October 27th, I continued reading The Queen's Gambit. October 28th, I read Try, the Yotsuba one-shot and webcomics, sort of the origins of Yotsuba. I read all of those little things, and I also continued reading The Queen's Gambit. On October 29th, I finished reading The Queen's Gambit, and I also read Pen Pal at the End of the World. just a little one-shot thing. So it's a how we say, a one and done ski. On October 30th, I read Thus Spoke Rohan Kishibe, Volume 1. And finally, on October 31st, I read Turns Out My Dick Was a Cute Girl, Chapter 27. And that, on that note, that completes the month of October for 2023. Okay, that's yes. So for October, I read 42 volumes, 8 chapters, and 2 books, with an average of 1.355 volumes per day. Yepers. On November 6th, I read Thus Spoke Rohan Kishibe Volume 2, which completes that little Rohan thingamajig. And I also started reading I Had That Same Dream Again, the novel, not the manga this time. On November 7th, I finished reading I Had That Same Dream Again. Still the novel, not the manga this time. On November 10th, I read Kubo Won't Let Me Be Invisible, Volume 8. November 11th, I read Kubo Won't Let Me Be Invisible, Volume 9, and I started reading Letter from an Unknown Woman and Other Stories by starting and completing the first story, Letter from an Unknown Woman. On November 12th, I read A Story Told in Twilight, the second story from Letter from an Unknown Woman and Other Stories. On November 13th, I read The Debt Paid Late and Forgotten Dreams from Letter from an Unknown Woman and Other Stories, and that completes Letter from an Unknown Woman and Other Stories. And I also read Our Dreams at Dusk, Volumes 1 and 2. Then on November 14th, I read Our Dreams at Dusk, Volumes 3 and 4, and that completes that series. On November 15th, I read the 15th volume of Don't Toy With Me, Miss Nagatoro. November 18th, I read Oran High School Host Club, Volume 1. On November 19th, I read I Think I Turned My Childhood Friend Into a Girl, Volume 4. November 23rd, I read Watamote, Chapter 217, Part 3. And on November 25th, I read Vinland Saga, Chapter 207, and that will complete the month of November. November was pretty shit. I read 10 volumes, 2 chapters, and I read 2 books, that's alright. It was an average of 0.33333 recurring volumes per day. Yeah. On December 7th, I read Watamote, Chapter 218. December 11th, I read Yotsuba, Chapter 112. On December 14th, I started reading I'll Change the World. December 16th, I continued reading I'll Change the World. December 17th, I continued reading I'll Change the World. Then, all the way on December 28th, I read Watamote, Chapter 219. And on December 29th, I started reading A Christmas Memory. On December 30th, I continued reading A Christmas Memory. And finally, on December 31st, I finished reading A Christmas Memory. And that will complete the month of December, and that will complete the year of 2023. What a shitty limp dick ending month to the year. Going out with a we were really going out with a dribble in December for 2023 after such a good year for the rest of the year. So yes, December was by far the worst month of the year. We read 0 volumes of manga, we read 3 chapters, and we actually read 1.5 books. Which is an average of 0.000 volumes per day. But yes, we read 1.5 books. I did not finish reading I'll Change the World. So in my every book I read this year video, I lied. I did not finish I'll Change the World in time for the end of the year. So I'll have to read the other half of that in 2024 at some point. Rightio, just to wrap things up in a neat little bow, let's just go over a few final little statistics that might be of minor intrigue to you. So, for the year of 2023, I read a total of 366 volumes. That is an average of 1.003 volumes per day. We just hit that, just above that 1 volume per day mark, which I'm so happy to hit. I'm very, very glad about that. I also read 51 chapters, which would sort of correlate to at least around 3 or 4 volumes-ish, maybe more. And I also read 17 and a half books. We didn't quite finish that last book, I Will Change the World. Days I read something versus days I didn't. There were 235 days that I read something. Whether that be 5 volumes or just 1 chapter, there was 235 days I read just anything, something. Which in turn means there was 130 days where I read absolutely nothing. Oh, I also read a lot more volumes online this year. You know, I don't really like reading online. I try to read things physically, but there was a few volumes this year where it's like, there's no English release. There might never be an English release. I just want to read it. I felt in the mood to read it, so I wanted to read it. Also, JoJo's. When I caught up with part 5, I then decided, fuck it, I want to read part 6 and 7, so I had to read them online. So in total, I read 65 volumes online, which in turn means the other 301 I read physically in my hands. Oh, and obviously all the chapters I read were also read online. Oh, and all the books I read was also read in hand. I am known as the sort of the Yuri connoisseur of manga tube. I'm sort of the god of Yuri. And this year I read approximately 11 and a half Yuri mangas. 2 of those were full rereads of stuff that I'd read previously. But yes, 11 and a half Yuri manga this year. Is that more or less than last year? I neglected to check. You'll have to go watch last year's video again to check those stats for me. Now, just lastly, what was the favourite thing that I read all year? I guess we'll start with manga, since this is the manga reading log. My favourite manga, it's got to be still between Slam Dunk or Vinland Saga or Kashimashi Girl Meets Girl. Strong honourable mention to JoJo's Part 7 and The Boy Who Cried Wolf Tells a Lie Today also. I think I will tentatively go with Slam Dunk as my favourite manga I read all year. But it really could be any of the ones I just mentioned. They're all really good. The favourite book I read, it could have been the reread of Dusty. I really enjoyed that. But I won't count that because it was a reread. So other than that, it could have been probably either The Time Machine or Animal Farm. But there were some other good ones too. I'm not sure, so I'm just going to neglect to make a decision. Haircut status, uncut still. And that's sort of all I have statistically. You know, I could have done more. I could have broken down how much of each particular genre I read and this and that and all sorts of different fun little things. But that would take a lot of work and I didn't want to do that. So I didn't do it. Anyways, I'm sure this video is quite long enough as is, so let's not drag it out unnecessarily so. So thanks for watching, and as always, it's Tiffy time, motherfuckers.
It's just another Tuesday. Tuesday. And if you were in for a spell where it falls into an order, you can help that. Well, yeah. No.
Ugh.